Welcome to Education Forum. I'm Herman Badillo, Vice Chairman of the Board of Trustees of the City University. The improvement of education affects all New Yorkers. This program will focus on the key issues and challenges before us all. My guest today is Dr. Ester Fuchs, who is the Director of Urban Policy and Research at Columbia University. She is a graduate of Queens College, where she got her BA. She got her MA from Brown University and her PhD from the University of Chicago. And she is a specialist on urban affairs. But Dr. Fuchs, this year, it seems that the main issue at all levels of government is education, because we have an education president, an education governor, and an education mayor. And I felt, when I was listening to President Clinton, that I could have written his speech on education, because he talked about eliminating social promotion in all the schools in this country. What is your view about that?
I think social promotion obviously has been a disaster, but I think it's only part and parcel of a larger disaster. And if we don't, remedy the problems of giving children a quality education, then it shouldn't surprise us that we're promoting kids who are not really capable of doing the work of their grade. So while I'm in favor of eliminating social promotion, I think simultaneously we've got to tackle the real issues of educating kids in our schools. The
President referred to Chancellor Balance in Chicago, and he talked about his program as the one that he would like to see implemented, I assume in New York City as well. In Chicago, when they eliminated social promotion 3 years ago, about 25% of the students were left back, and then they were put in retention. What would you do in addition to that in New York City?
Well, it's interesting, you're right to say that all three levels of government now seem to have coalesced around the idea of needing to improve education. And I mean, it shouldn't surprise us, because when we look at the public opinion polls, the public's been clamoring for this now for several years. Education is the top issue that people care about and worry about in the country right now, focusing on every level of government.
And with good reason. You remember a report issued about a month ago. The Public Education Association said that in New York City, only 48% of the students graduate in 4 years from high schools. And that is a disastrous figure.
Right, and what's fascinating to me, and I mean, I'm really hoping this is the political moment of turning around the issue. I mean, there are so many forces now that are articulating the problem and saying it's time to do something about it. But those of us who have been paying attention to this for a long time and working in the policy arena as well as in the political sector, like yourself, have seen this develop over years and years. This is not a one-day problem that we've just noticed. The pothole in the street sprang up yesterday. This is not the issue in public education.
Okay, suppose you became the chancellor of the public school system in New York City tomorrow. What would you do?
Well, first of all, I agree with the mayor that there shouldn't be a chancellor and a board of education. I really believe it should be a straight-line city agency where the mayor has direct control with the consent of the city council, playing, I would hope, an important role. So I would want the public school system to be a line agency. Some of the very serious problems, I think, that we have in the New York City system now are really structural problems that require Albany to kind of let go of some of the controls that they now have over the New York City public school system.
You mean when you say Albany, do you mean the governor and the legislature, or do you mean the Board of Regents?
I mean the governor and the legislature primarily. The Board of Regents is a complicated political animal, but particularly the governor and the legislature, which has engaged itself in some of the sort of day-to-day issues that really need to be left up to the mayor and a school chancellor, or whatever we would have as our primary official in charge of the education system. From my point of view, I believe that there has to be what we call school-based management, where principals have control over their schools, but at the same time, no tenure for principals, particularly, the tenure to a school. I mean, slowly we have been eroding a system which I think has corrupted itself, essentially. And I'm not going to throw darts or point fingers at who's culpable and who's responsible, because now is the time really for all people of goodwill to get up and say, let's change it. But that's the first example of what I think needs to be changed.
Well, let me take that, because it's interesting that the council speaker, Peter Vallone, has also come out for abolishing the Board of Education and the Chancellor and turning it over to what you say now. The mayor is also supporting eliminating tenure of principals. How do you feel about tenure for teachers? Would you keep that?
I'm conflicted on the issue of tenure altogether. I think part of the problem is you need to have some sort of job security, particularly when you're not creating a pay scale that's commensurate with other school districts in the region, which we don't have. So our best teachers have little economic incentive to stay in the system. So there's a problem along those lines, and if tenure is something that can keep people in the system, that's fine, but there's a limited form of tenure. Teachers should not be able to, on the basis of seniority, essentially go to the school they want to be in there and stay there forever. There has to be some capacity for principals to hire the best teachers and get rid of the teachers in their schools that don't function. And they shouldn't be then dumped on some poor school that has, an ineffective principal or a parent body that isn't sufficiently involved. And so you end up having, a system which creates some extremely poor schools within the system and some really, really excellent schools. There has to be capacity, I think, to get rid of the principals and the teachers who can't function to improve schools in the system. And that's the first starting point, it seems to me.
Well, now, on the question of teachers, one of the things that President Clinton talked about was that teachers should not be teachers unless they have specialized on the subject that they are teaching. And that is something that Diane Ravitch said in this program, that she feels that instead of teachers getting a degree in education, they should be getting degrees in whatever subject they're going to teach, English or science or whatever, and that the degree in education really is not too meaningful. What's your view on that?
Well, I would create a slight adjustment to that. I think that there are many degrees in education which are worthless, as there are many degrees in other areas that are worthless as well. I believe that teachers do need to concentrate in a field and know a particular field well, whether it's going to be math, history, science, English. They need to know their subject matter. But I also believe that there is a pedagogy, there is a field of education, and that there are methodologies of teaching for particular environments, some which work better than others. And, I see that in the university level where people are not trained as teachers, and boy, do we have a lot of mediocre teachers in the university system. And, frankly, it's not part of the reward system, so it doesn't matter in a lot of places. But the truth is that the capacity to teach, it's not all inborn. There are really a methodology which I think a lot of people could benefit from. And so what we have now, unfortunately, is a lot of teachers who probably don't have the methodology, the tools to be good teachers, and don't have the substantive area of expertise. So I would not eliminate, schools of education. I believe that that has a place, and it's important.
But you could have a specialty within.
Absolutely, everybody should have. Everybody who goes in needs to have a specialty, and I believe, particularly in the early childhood years, there is really a field in which if you've spoken to people or if you've engaged in the classroom with teachers who really know the field of early childhood, you can see the difference between babysitting children who are 3, 4, and 5 versus teaching children who are 3, 4, and 5. So even at that early stage, there is a real discipline and a real field of which many people, particularly in those early years, have no clue about. They think, oh, any grandmother can take care of little children and everything is fine. There's a real qualitative difference.
Now, suppose we have a change in the structure in New York City, and we have a chancellor or a commissioner appointed by the mayor and confirmed by the city council. Would you maintain the community superintendents? Because that sets up another layer of bureaucracy where you have the school and the principal, and then you have the district superintendent, and then you have the chancellor. Would you keep that structure too?
I think the existing structure doesn't work.
Okay.
That's very clear. And I think, you know, the neighborhood-based school boards, unfortunately, haven't worked, even though they can work in other settings. They don't work in New York. So I think that this is the moment in which I would experiment with different forms of decentralization, if you will, where you don't have it totally hierarchical. I think the system is just too big, as you well know, to really run everything from one centralized office. Whether it's firstly a borough-based divide, I think Ed Kostikian had proposed that in one of his earlier commissions, which I think could potentially work effectively. You need to have district-based superintendents for sure. The question is, who do they report to, and what is the amount of control you give them over hiring and firing, and what's the recourse when things are not working? I think one of the biggest problems in the current system is when things don't work, there's no recourse. Whether it's parents or the teachers or the principals who want to say, we have a problem here, there's no place to go.
Okay, here's one of the things that don't work, and that is special education,
Right.
which takes up still 1/4 of the budget, over $2 billion. And as you know, the students go into special education are never evaluated. Very few of them ever get out of special education or get any kind of education, special or otherwise.
That's right.
So it doesn't work. What would you do about that?
Okay, well, I mean, I think this has been a travesty in the school system. And, you know, part of what happens, I think people need to understand that these structures emerge not by accident. There's negative incentive systems that are put into the school structure that, and you know, that's why we end up with these really dysfunctional outcomes. So special education is a really good example. You know, why did principals channel so many kids into special education? It wasn't because, you know, they always thought this was the best avenue for all these kids. There were two reasons, as far as the empirical research I've seen suggest. One has to do with the funding formula. Basically, schools which have been overcrowded for quite some time found this as a way of reducing classroom size. And the more kids you put into special education, the more money you got from Albany, essentially, because that was a targeted class with a special stream of funding, as both you and the mayor know well. So it encouraged the expansion of special education as the rest of the school system became overcrowded. It was a vehicle for principals to just sort of peel people off.
So how would you change that now?
So, I mean, clearly you cannot create a funding formula that simply uses special education as a way of creating small classes. So the first thing to do is that funding has to be targeted simply to the number of kids in your school, and that small class size has to be available, or reasonable class size, we don't even have to say small class size, all across the board. I mean, one of the frustrating things about looking at the education problem, as you know well, because you know, you have really been in the minefields for years on this, and in many ways I think have been prescient, is we know that small class sizes produce better learning for children. I mean, this does not take rocket science. We know that if you can reduce the size of classes, kids do better. It's not that they do great, but they do better. So there's, you know, not linking funding to streams in special education, allowing for reasonable size classes where you don't have, you know, 35 kids with one teacher. I mean, you need to have a situation, from my understanding of the literature, where, you know, it's 27 kids to a teacher, but better yet, 2 teachers in a classroom and 1 paraprofessional, so you can break kids up in groups.
And you know, that's not an exaggeration. My wife, as you know, is a teacher.
That's right.
And she has 35 to 37 kids in the 7th grade, which makes life very difficult. We will be back after this announcement.
Tom, where you going? Man, we got a ball game here. Pardon me.
Pitcher got a rubber arm. It's has. Huh? Pitcher has a rubber arm.
If education is important to you, talk to your child's school about raising academic standards. Call 1-800-38-BE-SMART for a free booklet and be a big league parent.
We're back with Dr. Ester Fuchs, who is director of the Urban Research and Policy Center at Columbia University. Now, on special education, what about task force that Mayor Giuliani has set up, headed by Peter Powers, which is trying to get some of the special education kids back into the regular mainstream?
You know, I think it's a very complicated problem there really are experts who understand the issue of special education, and I am not one of them. And I don't, really propose to be an expert in everything on this issue. And I would like to see what this task force produces as a solution. And I would hope that they would go forward, not assuming that there is, at this moment, one better way to deal with special education. There are clearly some children who should be mainstreamed, and there are some children who should not be. A lot of kids were put into special education because of language difficulties. A lot of kids ended up there because nobody had the sense to do eye tests or reading tests and discovered that they need glasses or that they need help in speech or hearing. So, I mean, the first thing one wants to do is sort of clean up that mess, essentially, which really, unfortunately, wasn't working well. But the issue of who gets mainstreamed versus who stays in special classes, I think that has to be resolved within the community of educators who really understand the needs of children, and the children's needs should come first in that.
The problem is that the public is getting very impatient with the fact that educators have not resolved these problems. And that is one of the reasons why there's a movement nationally and in New York State and New York City towards charter schools and vouchers. For example, as you know, the state legislature just approved 100 charter schools for the city and state of New York, and there are steps being taken now to establish those, primarily to show that an alternative to the public school system is better. What's your view of charter schools?
First of all, I don't think educators have really been given the opportunity to resolve the problems. The fundamental problems in New York City public schooling, I think, were overtly political. No political will to change this structure. I mean, what's been fascinating to me is we've had a couple of incremental changes that nobody thought could be done in the state legislature. For example, giving the chancellor power to take over the dysfunctioning schools.
Yeah, but that took 20 years to get done.
Well, but it shouldn't have taken 20 years. That's the point. So the people stuck toiling in the fields of the school system, some of whom are excellent and very dedicated, some of whom are not. I don't want to sort of paint the whole thing over with one brush and say all of these educators have been given the opportunity to reform. They haven't. I mean, principals who have been put in situations in which they don't have the funding to operate their schools successfully or effectively, stuck with these silly formulas that make no sense related to special education. In many ways, they've made wrong choices. In many ways, they hadn't any choices. They were constrained by what I would view to be a dysfunctional structure. And so there are a lot of villains, I believe, a lot of villains in, urban education policy. Yeah, and the result is that the schools, the public school system has come into disrepute. So it doesn't surprise me, for example, that there's support for charter schools and there's support for vouchers, because there hasn't been the political will to essentially blow up this structure and allow the public school system to function. Let me ask you one question, which is, and this is a question that fascinates me in this debate, and you can see that I don't have a strong position on this yet, because I believe the system has to come apart, and I'm not sure what works yet. I mean, in terms of the vouchers and charter schools. I believe charter schools is a very important thing in the right direction. But, the issue of privatization very broadly, particularly when it comes to public schooling, one of the things that I find fascinating is you find the clamoring for all of these reforms, these very, very serious, broad reforms, in urban public school systems which are failing. Right. You don't find them in Scarsdale or Larchmont or the rich suburban public school systems. Right. These are all public school systems which are all working. So it's not public. It's not the public piece.
No, but you're a specialist.
The dysfunctional bureaucracy.
But you're a specialist in urban problems, and so am I to some extent. But that is exactly the issue. The biggest crisis that we have in America today is the urban crisis. And to a large extent, as you know, it's a racial crisis, because it has to do with kids who are African American or Hispanic, who are concentrated in the urban centers. But that's precisely why we have to address the problem. We know how to educate middle-class kids from suburban areas, by and large. We know how to educate kids in private schools. We don't know how to educate kids who are poor, who are concentrated in urban centers, and that's the problem.
I think
so the
we
whole
do.
idea,
I think we
well,
do. There
no,
are so
but-
many. We have so
Well,
many
we-
experiments all over New York City.
Yeah,
The
but we
New
haven't
Vision
been
schools.
able to establish it in any general
Well,
way.
that's the
key.
political piece.
Well,
We know. See,
so what would you
bothers
do?
me
I go
is-
back to my
right,
question. What would you
well,
do?
I mean, I obviously have an answer to that question, but what bothers me most is we actually know from an education point of view, we know what works. We know really what works. I mean, if you look at Debbie Mayer's New Vision School in Harlem, and some of the other sort of quasi-charter school experiments around the city, part of it was taking the school out of the rules and regulations of 110 Livingston Street, taking it out of the rules of regulations of the teachers union, giving the principal control over their teachers
but Debbie Mayer's,
with a good
but Debbie
quality
Mayer's is
staff
precisely
and small classes.
Exactly, but Debbie Mayer's alternative school is exactly what has led to the charter school movement, and what that says or suggests is that what works is not an educational bureaucracy, but small schools which are not part of a bureaucracy, where individuals take charge of the school. Is that what you think should be done?
No, I
Because from a
believe.
practical point of view, it becomes difficult to do that on a citywide basis.
Well, that's the question. The question ultimately is, how do you take these small experiments and sort of ratchet them up to citywide policy? And that's been a problem in New York. And I think a lot of people believe, you know, the only way to do it is pull it out of this public school framework, which seems to be controlled by people not willing to make change. I don't know if that's the answer. What I would like to see, several experiments operating at the same time. I think the charter schools discussion is the right discussion to have now, and that we need to start creating these neighborhood-based schools with oversight, because just like decentralization
Now, who would be the
created-
oversight?
Right, you have to have the city as part of the oversight, you know.
Yeah, but
you
then we
know.
get back to the same chancellor who controls the other schools. That's why they want the people who want charter schools don't want the regular
I don't
chancellor
think the
controlling.
problem is with the chancellor. I think that office is capable of doing oversight. They can point out what doesn't work. The problem is fixing it. So my view is you have to give people an enormous amount of flexibility on the fixing side, on the implementation side, if you will, on what works in for a particular community. But at the same token, without the oversight, you end up with the same problem you had in the decentralization struggles of the 60s with corrupt neighborhood-based boards, where in many poor communities they operated as political machines to give out patronage.
Okay, I'm told by some of the teachers that I've talked to and some of the schools where I've spoken that we now have in New York City an increasing number of students who are coming in from the Dominican Republic and Mexico and Central America, who are 12, 13, and 14 years old, who have never been to any school, because in the urban centers, in the Caribbean and Latin America, they have schools, but not in the rural areas.
Right.
So what would you do with those kids?
Right. That's a special problem, which I think needs to be moved out
And
of
getting
the
larger
general
and larger,
debate.
though.
You see, but that's the point. When you take a very simple, what is normally a suburban model, including the charter schools and vouchers, and talk about what works effectively and how much money. I love the studies where they compare the dollars per pupil spent. Those are ridiculous comparisons, because the nature of the problem and the needs in communities differ, and where the money's being spent is not all in the classroom. So those dollars per pupil spent mean nothing. If you have the community that you just pointed out, obviously they can't be mainstreamed simply into a public school system that has no services and no capacity to serve them. It will only be disruptive for the people who are there and create more problems for them. I mean, when there used to be those old, what were they called, 600 schools, where people who were behavior problems got pulled out of the classroom and that became unconstitutional. My point of view is sometimes in order to make the classroom work, you have to be able to pull people out who create dysfunction for the rest of the class.
Okay.
And so in this instance, I would argue that you need a special program to get those kids up to speed, or they're going to become, problems in the classroom for the teachers, who then will not be able to, focus on the 90% of the other kids who don't have that problem.
But you said before that you felt that there was too much interference in individual things by the governor and the state legislature, and just recently the governor announced that he's going to have a Moreland Commission investigating the Board of Education. So how does that fit into your suggestions?
Well, Well, you know, I'm a political scientist and also obviously a policy analyst, but, you know, by training I tend to look at the politics of policy as well as the substance, obviously. And what is so depressing about education policy is how political it really is. And so, you know, somebody can have the really most reasonable proposal about how to fix the system, as we both know, but the politics gets in the way. And right now, you know, I hope that the governor's intentions are good here, but what is the point of a commission right now? We know what's broken. I mean, here I am, an academic who, you know, makes her living partly by doing policy research, and I'm willing to sit here in your presence and say, there's so much policy research in this field. We know what works and we know what doesn't work.
All right, now we have 1 minute left. If you could be talking to the governor now, look him in the eye, and you could only make one suggestion of what works, what would you suggest?
I would say give New York City schools back to New York City. Take away state control over teachers' contracts and issues related to who can, you know, contracts that are given to the superintendents in school buildings. Give that back to the mayor and the council to work out a structure that is appropriate for each community in this in the city. Give us our money and stay out of the school system. That's what I would say to the governor right now. Give us our fair share of school aid, which we don't get right now, and stay out of the policy making here, because it's complicated, as everybody knows. All the people who are advocating, you know, the new federalism and the devolution for welfare policy, well, it's the same thing in education. We need it back in the city.
Thanks for the advice to the governor. Unfortunately, we haven't even had time to talk about the City University because we've been stuck on K-12, so you're going to have to come back again. Thanks for coming. You can reach us by email at our website, www.cunytv.cuny.edu, to let us know what you think, or write to us at CUNY TV, 25 West 43rd Street, Suite 1220, New York, New York, 10036.